Hello, my name is Michael Lambert, and today I want to talk about money. I want to talk about British taxpayers' money, the money which the government has been wasting in huge amounts over the past few years to the benefit of almost no one apart from Tory donors and friends of Tories. And I'm concerned that it's going to be forgotten because things tend to fade from memory. I'm talking about PPE, and I'm talking about test and trace, and I'm talking about bounce back loans and so on. All of these things are huge scandals which seem to have faded into the background and are not much talked about these days. So those are some of the things I want to touch on. But I've followed politics for many years, and I've always found politicians very interesting and so on. And I must say, I've never ever been in a situation where I've seen a government quite as extraordinarily incompetent as this one. At every level, at every department, there's chaos. It's just a complete and utter mess from top to bottom, with, of course, extremely, extremely bad, weak leadership that we have at the moment. But you have to look at, look at any department. Look at the health department. We've got 7 million people on the waiting list. That's 10% of the population. How can you have a population of 67 million, have 7 million people waiting for hospital treatment? And millions of those are people who could be working and paying taxes, but they're sat at home waiting for hospital treatment. It's never been this bad before. If you look at, look at everything. Look at how we tip our sewage in the rivers and the seas, and then we have the minister, what's her name, Coffey, telling us that the waters are all much cleaner than they were under Labour, and that 95% of our beaches are spotlessly clean, and all the rest of it. Just lying to us. How stupid do they think we are? Look at transport, the most expensive railways in the world. Half the time they're on strike, and potholes in the road. It's just general loss of control everywhere. And you look at the Home Office, by far the worst department of all. Look at the police and the trouble with the Met and so on. Look at crime. The clear-up rate for crime now is 5%. So if you commit a crime, you've got a 95% chance of getting away with it. And this is ridiculous. And you've seen probably those organised riots of youngsters going shoplifting in Oxford Street and so on. And they'll all get away with it. And there was a programme, I think there was an item on the television last week about shoplifting and how shop employees and security guards in shops are told not to approach anybody who's shoplifting because they might get injured, in which case the employer, that's the employer of the shop, or the employer of the security guard might get sued, or if they injure the person who's doing the shoplifting, that person might sue them. In other words, lay off shoplifters. Don't let them all know. Let the word get round. You can go shoplifting without any risk of any penalty. And as I think I've said this before, as we get poorer and as people get more and more desperate, a lot of people are going to resort to crime, knowing that it's just easy to get away with. And we've had this massive influx of drugs lately, haven't we? And we've got drug gangs all over the places. I watched a programme recently about Southend-on-Sea, and they were saying there how the drug gangs were involved in all sorts of violence and so on. This is something we're going to have to deal with, because as we get poorer, this is more and more likely to happen. And look at immigration. It's just ridiculous. But this is the absolute focus of this government. We must just focus on little boats. To hell with everything else. And we have this absolute fool of a Prime Minister, this complete pathetic idiot, jumping around in little short trousers, grinning at everybody with his extremely expensive fluorescent teeth and telling everybody, everything's absolutely fine. Whatever you say, it's absolutely fine. He went to some beer festival a couple of weeks ago, and he was heckled whilst he was there. And then he was interviewed afterwards saying about, a lot of pubs are suffering. The pubs are having a really bad time. Well, obviously pubs are having a bad time because in the first place, all their expenses have gone up. They can't get staff. And if they do get staff, they've got to pay them too much money. So they have to put all their prices up at a time when nobody's got any money. And the first thing you're going to cut out is trips to the pub if you're hard up. And soon I was confronted with this. He said, no, he'd been talking to people. They said they're doing fantastically well. How stupid does this man think we are? And he's the Prime Minister. And he's terrified of everybody. He's terrified of a brave man. And do you know what's happening now? And it's something I knew it was going to happen. It was absolutely bound to happen. Until now, whenever the question of Brexit has come up and any problems with Brexit, ministers always said, "Oh, it's all to do with it's all COVID, it's a pandemic," and after that they said, "Oh, it's all Putin. Putin, that was the problem." But now they can't use those excuses anymore because everybody else is affected by Putin and everybody else has got over the pandemic. So what they're saying now, and I heard 3 ministers say this last week, it almost certainly is coming from a Conservative head office. What they say is, we're just carrying out the will of the British people. It's what the British people wanted. And they've known full well that since almost immediately after the referendum, people started to have doubts about Brexit, and they know that a significant majority now regret it and would like to go back into the EU if it were ever possible. And yet still they're saying, no, we've been pursuing Brexit. And 70%, as I said before, 70% of the cabinet, 21 out of 30, voted to remain anyway, so they're all living a lie, they're all turncoats, because they all told Johnson, oh yes, we believe in Brexit, in order to get back into Parliament again. And as the economy gets worse and worse, the cost of living crisis goes up and up, the quality of life diminishes all the time, more and more talented people are leaving the country, they're flooding out. I mean, I know this from my own experience. And there was an interesting article yesterday in the Daily Telegraph. Now, the Daily Telegraph, as you know, is a staunch Conservative supporting newspaper, pro-Brexit, right behind the government. This was an article by a guy called Sam Ashworth-Hayes, and the article was titled, "If you're under 50, it's time to jump ship. Get out of Britain while you can." Now, when your strongest supporting newspaper, almost, prints that, you know you're in trouble. You know something's going wrong. And I thought back to, in terms of talent leaving the country, I thought back to that Tory conference when Priti Patel was giving a speech, and she was being very patronising, excuse me, talking down to everybody about how she'd managed to stop free movement, or she wouldn't have any more free movement. But she did announce shortly after that, she said that she was going to issue up to 500 visas, or she was going to invite applications for up to 500 visas for the brightest and the best. During the course of the speech, she did mention the sort of people she wanted was Nobel Prize winners. And that was 2 years ago. And so far, the number of applications for those visas is, it's 3. People don't want to come here. We're sinking. Now, you might have heard, because it's been uttered by every single minister 1,000 times over in the last few months, that it costs £6 million a day to house asylum seekers in so-called hotels. Now, there are 47,500 asylum seekers in hotels being paid for by the government. And 6 million divided by 47,500 is £126 per person per day, except that most of these people are 2 or 3 to a room. So the hotels are getting somewhere between £250 and £400 per night per room. And these are generally pretty basic hotels. To give you an idea, the Premier Inn, which is, I think that some Premier Inns are being used, but Premier Inn, the standard rate for, the average rate for a room in that chain is £71.80 a night at the moment. So these hotels are getting between 3 and 4 times as much as it would cost to book a room in a Premier Inn. Now, either the government are lying to us, or they're vastly overpaying. Either's possible. It's our money, so it doesn't really matter. Incidentally, there was a hotel in Llanelli on television the night, featured on the television. It is a 4-star hotel called Stradley Park, and they closed the hotel, ripped out taken out all their beds. They've put in bunk beds, and they're packing into 77 rooms 241 people. So it'll be 2 or 3 to the room, for which they're going to be getting between £250 and £400 a night. They'll be providing very basic food, I'm sure, and it's probably a contract for 6 months, a year, who knows what. So for the hoteliers to rip off the government is so easy. So easy. And it's we who pay for it, the British taxpayer. Now, 2 things that are gradually fading from memory are test and trace and PPE. And so I thought I'd have another quick look at test and trace. Now, the budget was 37 billion over 2 years, In fact, according to the National Audit Office, 25.7 billion had been spent up until June 2022, and the final budget was expected to be, or the final amount was expected to be around 29.3 billion. Now, this was in order to test people for COVID and to trace any contacts. They developed an app. The app cost £35 million, apparently. Bear in mind that Germany, with a much bigger population, much bigger country, spent 480 million. And we're talking about, not far short of 500 times as much as that, 25.7 billion. And I had a look at what some of this money was spent on. And I can tell you, for example, £632 million was spent on consultants, accountants. They were from PwC, EY, Deloitte and McKinsey, firms of accountants. They were supplying thousands and thousands of consultants at a minimum of £1,000 a day, sometimes going up to £5,000 a day, to do what I have absolutely no idea. You're testing people to see if they've got COVID, and then you're making phone calls to all their contacts to try and warn them. But this cost £632 million of accountancy fees. The cost of testing was £4,200,000. £4.2 billion for testing. I suppose these little packets are quite expensive, aren't they? They spent £3.145 billion on laboratories. I mean, you can build some pretty smart laboratories for £3.1 billion. Where are these laboratories? I mean, this was just a staggering waste of money. And not only that, they didn't keep proper accounts. So when the National Audit Office had a look at it, they said they couldn't sign off with the accounts because they hadn't got enough information. They hadn't kept proper accounts. Significant shortcomings in financial control and governance. That's the National Audit Office. This is billions, tens of billions of pounds of our money given to some woman, some sort of dim-wit woman who was not much of a success at talk. I mean, this extraordinary waste of money for what achieved almost nothing. And the Public Accounts Committee, when they looked into it, they said it achieved almost nothing and it was a complete waste of money. Dido Harding, when challenged about this, said, well, it was never expected to work on its own. I mean, you can't budget £37,000 million and expect it to work on its own. I mean, this amount of money is so staggering. And yet it's kind of being forgotten. Nobody's being brought up for it. Nobody's been embarrassed about it. Nobody's being asked, why did you spend more than £500 million on accountants when you're doing test and trace? Where did this money go? How many Tory donors got contracts that made them fortunes? And then there's PPE, isn't there? Look at PPE. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. The National Audit Office again had a look at this, and they said that the total write-down costs of PPE was 15 billion. That's 15 billion written off. This is 15 billion where people had bought the wrong stuff, or it was wrong quality, or it was out of date, or or whatever. And even now, we're spending a fortune, an absolute fortune, storing this stuff in fields, waiting for it to be burnt. This is our money, taxpayers' money. Where was the responsibility? And, all over the country, there are people who are experts on PPE. I've spent years and years and years dealing with China, and it's important to get to know your supplier. It's important to know your stuff, to know about information about the products you're buying. It's very important to get inspection before anything is shipped and so on. And if you do all those things, then generally speaking, you'll ship the right stuff. But in this case, all these different people, all these people had no experience of PPE whatsoever, just saw an opportunity because they knew somebody in the Tory party, an opportunity to make a load of money. And so they jumped in and they were given all these contracts. Let me just tell you some of these because they are really, really extraordinary. There's a company here called INEPT. They're registered in Mauritius for tax purposes, so we won't see any of the profit there. They got a contract for 252 million. Uniserv, that's a company, a transport company. They were delivering all this stuff when it arrived, and they must have thought this is a good racket. Everybody seems to make a lot of money. So they jumped in on it. They started buying PPE. A lorry company, a transport company, buying PPE to supply the government. What do they know about it? They're now being paid to store it before it's burnt. A firm called P14 Medical Supplies had assets of £145 when they got a contract for £115 million. Pestfix, it's a pest control company. They got a contract for £106 million. Got 16 employees. Chanderboy Agencies, which is a sweet wholesaler. What do they know about PPE? £107 million contract. And so it goes on. I mean, the companies here, there's one down here, got a contract, it's only £18 million. Aventis Solutions had total assets of £332. But just knew somebody in the Tory party. And the profits these people made, I mean, just staggering the profits they made. For example, I can give you again, take that firm that was paying Owen Paterson to lobby for them, paying him $100,000 a year. They made a profit the year before COVID of £12 million, and after they supplied the testing stuff, test and tray, £50 million profit. Primer Designs sold test kits. They made a profit of 1.3 million before, 178 million the next year. You see, with these things here, if you're supplying a government and the government got a clue, the chances of ripping them off is just so easy. So you just that's the price. And they were desperate to get it, so they just said yes, okay. And so all these firms, it's not just Michelle Mone. I mean, she gets a lot of publicity. I mean, she's just one of dozens and dozens and dozens of firms and people who've become multi-millionaires as a result of having known a Tory. And all these huge profits they've taken out to buy themselves Bentleys, houses in the Cotswolds and yachts and even a private plane. I think Michelle Mone bought herself a private plane. All these millions, billions that have been taken out. It's our money. They've all profited. Nobody's going to be questioned about this. Nobody's going to be brought up about it. Oh, they're having a go for Michelle Mone. The rest of them all get away with it. And they're all, if you go through, they're almost all Tory donors or Tory councils or whatever. There's somebody who knew somebody in the Tory party, and the name got put through. And as I've said before, no one's suggesting for a moment that Lord Bethel or Matt Hancock or Michael Gove or Priti Patel, all those who facilitated these contacts by pushing them through, no one's suggesting for a moment that any one of them would have got a backhander or a reward for any of this. Oh, no. That would have been bribery. That would have been corruption. That would never have happened. It's all our money. And it's these clowns, these utter incompetent clowns, who are still running the country. Now, the last thing I wanted to remind you about and to mention was the bounce back loans. Now, when COVID first hit, the government came up with a plan for bounce back loans for small businesses. So if you had a small business and you were going to have to struggle a bit, you could get a loan from the government. And what you had to do, you had to go onto the website, you put in what your last year's turnover was, name your company, and how much you wanted to borrow. Your maximum you could borrow is 20%, maximum of 50,000. So if you put in 250,000 in your last year's turnover, you could borrow £50,000. All you had to do was the name of the company, your name, and the two amounts. And the money went straight to your account. Put your bank details. Within 2 or 3 days, the money was in your account. No checks whatsoever. You didn't have to put in a passport, a driving license, a photo ID, nothing. Just give them the money. And of course, every crook and his wife was on it. Millions of thousands and thousands of people claimed loans. Always a maximum amount. There's one guy who was featured in Private Eye, formed 20 companies. This guy runs a chain of shops all over the country. Still going, never been challenged, has never been chased for it. 20 companies he formed, new companies, claimed 50,000 for each one, claimed £1 million in bounce back loans. His business is still going. Nobody's ever bothered him. No, better write it off. Easy to write it off. Do you know the amount that was written off? I'll tell you, it's staggering. This is according to the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. I don't know what that is actually, but anyway, the amount written off was 37% of all the loans, amounting to 17 billion. And that's 17 billion just gone to crooks, just given away. And do you know who was the person who signed off on the PPE, on the test and trace, and on these bounce back loans? Whose idea these bounce back loans were? It's a guy you might have heard of called Sunak. This grinning, nodding, silly fool who's in charge of the country, telling us how well it's all going. It's an absolute disgrace, and these people are not going to be brought to account, I'm sure. Maybe one or two of them, but very few of them. And it's all our money. And it's all this government, they're still in power, who are responsible. And it's pretty bad. It's pretty bad also, if I just finish by saying this, it's pretty bad also when you think of the position that so many people are in now. You know, people who are actually having to use food banks, people who are really, really worried, people who've got into debt to try and get by. And people who send their children to school without anything to eat. We keep hearing about children arriving in school not having had a breakfast and not being able to concentrate and all this sort of thing. You can't do this to children. And at the same time, all these people with their yachts and their new houses and their Bentleys and all the rest of it, it's just not right. And well, anyway, that's what I think about it. So if you watched this far, thank you very much, and keep smiling. And until next week, bye for now.